Hi, good morning to Mr. Solapsko and to whoever is listening right now. I am Maki Benedict A. Collis, and today I'm going to discuss all my learnings in this semester in GE Lit World. So it's going to be a synthesis video. So in this semester, I had three takeaways from my module, and I'll start with the first one, which is national and the global. When I first heard the term world literature, I honestly thought it just meant reading stories from different countries, like a reading tour around the globe. But after reading David Jamsrock World Literature, which is in national context, I realized it's much more than that. It's not just what we read, it's how we read it. Damsrock gives us a bunch of reminders about how literature travels across countries and how meaning changes in new contexts and why we need to be careful readers when crossing cultural boundaries. So, while reading these short stories from authors all over the world, I started noticing how Damsrock ideas actually plays out in real life. Now, here's how I saw it. Number one, stories don't become literature just because they're famous. They do when they travel and get read in new places. One of Dan's Rock's first big points is that world literature isn't about a book being globally known, but it's about being read and reread in different cultural contexts. It's the act of a story crossing borders, whether through translation or interpretation. That's what makes it part of the conversation. Then take Anton Chekhov's enigmatic nature. It's a Russian story from the 18,000s, but we're still reading it today in a totally different time and place. We don't need to be Russian to understand the main character manipulative charm, but we also wouldn't be reading it in English class without translation and circulation. The fact that we are analyzing it now outside of its country and time proves the point that a story becomes a world literature when it's on the move. So the second point is a story's meaning is rooted in its country, but that meaning can still shift depending on who's reading it. Damshock also says that while every story has a national context, its culture, history, politics, that doesn't limit it. In fact, once it travels, it gains new meaning. For example, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson is very American. It's very rooted in its American culture. It's about conformity and tradition in a small rural town. But when I read it, I didn't just think of America. I thought about how I thought about how people in any country, including mine, sometimes follow tradition blindly. Like for example, in politics, they follow traditions, they follow anything without even asking why. The story becomes a warning not just to Americans, but to anyone who participates in harmful systems because it's always been that way. So it's not just about the Americans, but it's also about systems or like traditions, but not American tradition, but in general tradition. So it's the same with Just Ladder. That's all by Hernando Teles. It's about a barber during a civil conflict in Colombia and his decision to kill or not kill a military officer. While I don't live in Colombia or in a war zone, I still felt the tension of choosing between duty and humanity. If I were him, I would choose to kill the officer because of his wrongdoings. But that's another story. The story's message shifts slightly depending on where it is being read, but its moral struggle remains relatable. And my third point is we should read, or Damshock point is we should read globally, but never forget where a story comes from. Damshock reminds reminds us that while it's great to connect with stories personally, we have to be careful not to erase or ignore their national context. That means taking the time to understand the setting, history, and culture behind the text. So we shouldn't let that out. Like with Luisa Valenzuela's vision out of the corner of one eye, it's easy to read it as a metaphor for women being watched and controlled. That's a valid takeaway. But if we skip learning about Argentina's dictatorship, we would totally miss how political the story really is. It's not just about gender, it's about surveillance, censorship, and fear during a time of repression. When we take that into account, the story becomes even more powerful. The same goes for the Taximan story by Catherine Lim. At first glance, it seems like a light, funny monologue from a judgmental taxi driver, but once you dig deeper into the Singaporean social values and gender expectation, it becomes a layered critique of hypocrisy, modernization, and family honor. Understanding the local lens helps us appreciate the story globally. Now, moving on post-colonial theory. Now, this concept is about rethinking literature and culture in light of the impacts of colonialism. It invites us to ask questions like who is telling the story, whose culture is represented, and whose voice is missing or distorted. Colonialism didn't just conquer land, it conquered how people thought, especially through language, education, and literature. Post-colonial reading helps expose hidden biases in texts, especially that present Western ways as superior. It also encourages readers to center the story of the colonized, not just those of the colonizers. Instead of only accepting Western perspectives, we start looking for the complex, diverse voices from formerly colonized nations and communities, including those who resisted or adapted in unique ways. In Telephone Conversation by Wal Soyinka, we see a simple but powerful moment that reveals deep issues around racism and post colonial identity. It's just a phone call between a black man and a white landlady, but the whole interaction is loaded with awkwardness and prejudice. The landlady only really cares about the color of his skin, asking bluntly, "How dark are you?" It's a perfect example of how racism, a leftover from colonial thinking, still shows up in everyday life. The man stays calm, even humorous, but you can tell he's frustrated. And this poem connects really well with Chimamanda's Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, where she talks about how the West often sees Africans in one narrow way, usually as poor, helpless, or different. The Africans. Adichie reminds us that people are more than just one version of a story, and Solinka shows us what it feels like to be reduced to a stereotype. Like, for example, people would say that African people do not have water, but in fact they do. And moving on, the spoken word peace, not poor, adds to this by flipping the narrative. It pushes back against the idea that communities without material wealth are automatically suffering or broken. Instead, the speaker takes pride in what they have, showing that riches isn't always about money. Then there are songs like You Got to Be Carefully Taught and Children Will Listen, which emphasize the hate and prejudice are taught from a young age. Like they would be manipulated or be reinforced of these learnings to act out prejudice. These messages really tie together, and all these pieces calls out the danger of inherited bias and challenge the way colonized people are seen and treated. and remind us to question the stories we accept as normal. Whether it's through poetry, storytelling, or songs, each one is about reclaiming identity, dignity, and complex in a world that often tries to simplify or silence certain voices. As per the learning of each modules, there's one thing that I have learned is that stories have layers and we experience them in different ways. From the discussion on the elements of a literary experience, I learned that engaging with a text isn't just about reading and understanding the plot. It's about experiencing it emotionally, critically, and even personally, and interpreting it in other ways. I was shocked multiple times with different symbolism and endings throughout the modules. That's why it is important that we engage with the text, that it isn't about just reading the text, but it's also about analyzing it, being critical about it. We need to react to the characters, feel their emotions, and sometimes reflect with the given materials with our own lives. This also taught me that literature isn't passive. It asks us to feel, imagine, and respond. And every element, whether it's theme, mood, or symbolism, adds a different layer to the experience. Moreover, when we explored the element of fiction, I realized that fiction, while it is made up, and it often tells emotional or human truths more powerfully than nonfiction. The characters, settings, and complex might be imaginary, but the feelings are real. And these stories helps us make sense of the world around us. And sometimes they can help us process our own experiences. Fiction doesn't lie. It transforms truth into something we can deeply connect to. Excuse me. Taking G-Lit World has made me realize how deeply stories shape not just how we see the world, but also how we understand ourselves and others. I used to think literature subject was just about analyzing metaphors or writing papers. But through our readings, discussion, and even creative activities like our for example, every module activity, our essays, I learned that literature helps build empathy, critical thinking, and self awareness. These are the things I know I'll carry with me beyond school. As an individual, this class helped me become more reflective. I've become more mindful of the narratives I consume and how they affect my worldview. I started asking questions like whose voice is being heard and whose story is being out. That kind of awareness pushes me to listen better, be more inclusive, and think more deeply about the impacts of the word of words. As a member of society, I've come to understand how important it is to recognize the power of storytelling, whether it is in media, politics, education, or even casual conversation. This course really taught me a lot, and GE2 taught me to be a more responsible and open minded consumer of information and a more conscious communicator. I hope to use what I've learned to contribute to a more understanding, empathetic, and just society where stories aren't used to divide but to connect. And I really appreciated how G-Elite World allowed space for both academic learning and personal growth. Whether it was exploring literary theories or seeing how a single poem could spark a deep conversation about race, identity, or truth, it made me realize how much literature reflects real life. So, yeah, that's all. Thank you so much, sir, and have a nice week ahead.